Thanks for joining us for our webinar on reducing crop production cost with a focus on fertility. I'm Jim Mintert, Director of the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture, and joining me are my colleagues Jim Camberato, who's a Professor of Agronomy and the Soil Fertility Specialist for Purdue Extension, and also Michael Langemeier, who's a Professor of Ag Economics and the Associate Director of the Center for Commercial Agriculture. We thought it'd be particularly relevant here in January of 2017 to think about ways that we could reduce production costs, and that's why we invited Jim Camberato to talk about the ways you could fine-tune your fertility program for corn and soybean production throughout the Corn Belt to try and reduce your cost per bushel. And so let's take a look at some of the information and maybe set the stage, Michael, with respect to why we want to focus on this. And you put together a chart along with Chris Hurt from our faculty.
Yeah, there's actually good news and bad news built into this chart. The good news is we've reduced break-even price on corn and soybeans rather dramatically in the last 2 years. On corn, for example, we've taken out 50 cents per bushel. On soybeans, it's over $1 a bushel. That's largely came from declining fertilizer prices or lower fertilizer prices, N, and K, but also declines in cash rent. The bad news is we've got another 40 cents to go on corn if you're looking at average productivity soil, and approximately another $1 to go on soybeans. And so we have done had done a good job of cutting costs, but we've got a little ways to go yet. And we've showed this slide before, Jim, on these webinars, but it looks like it's going to be about 2019 before revenue matches cost.
Yeah, we expect those two to come back together, and the question is how rapidly. And as we look at 17, we don't see it coming together here in 17, and we think the odds even in 2018 are going to be that we're facing a pretty big challenge. Yes. So our challenge is to look at all the ways we could reduce production costs, and of course fertility is one of those big costs. Let's take a look at some of the suggestions you had, Michael.
Yeah, this is just making it really simple here. We take variable cost, which is fertilizer, seed, pesticides, repairs, fuel, interest, crop insurance, general farm insurance, those kinds of things. And we add to that fixed cost, which are labor, machinery ownership, and land, and divide by yield, we get total cost per bushel. And as I indicated, if we're looking at corn, we need to take another 40 cents per bushel out of break-even price when we're looking at rotation corn. Continuous corn, it would be even more than that.
So when you think about those corn costs, you're on average productivity soil, you're currently estimating break-even at about, what, $4.40.
Yeah.
And our thinking has been that we need to reduce that and get it down in the ballpark of $4 a bushel, and or maybe less.
That doesn't mean we're going to have $4 cash price this fall, but that looks like where we're heading 2-3 years from now if you look at long-run forecasts. And so that's why we kind of do this rule of thumb. Let's get that break-even price down to $4.
When you look at soybeans, current break-evens on average productivity soil, maybe about $10.75,
Yeah, about $10.75, and we need to get that down to maybe $9.50, $9.75.
So we've got a ways to go.
We've got a ways to go.
And one of the things we're going to look at today is fertility, but actually we're going to look at more than that in some other webinars. So let's take a look at a variety of production cost on corn and soybeans.
And let me explain a little bit what we're trying to do with this slide. I've got cost category on the left there, and I've also got in parentheses whether that's a variable or fixed cost. And so I think that's important too. When you're looking at fixed costs, the key there, if you decrease fixed costs, you're going to decrease cost per bushel simply because you have less fixed costs spread over your production. So your fixed costs per bushel go down. When you're looking at variable costs, reductions, you have to be really, really careful when you're looking at something like seed, fertilizer, pesticides, and variable costs, because you don't want to also decrease yield when you're decreasing these variable costs. By definition, it's a variable cost because it depends on yield. Many times to get the higher yields, you need to spend a little bit more money with these variable costs. And so that's a very important distinction that I've made on the left-hand side there. Jim's got fertilizer cost, marked there or clearly indicated. That's because it's an extremely important cost for both rotation corn and rotation soybeans. And it is one of the costs we've had a lot of help in the last 2 years in terms of price declines, but it's still a cost that I think some producers can still manage a little bit better to squeeze some cost out.
And the other point I think, Michael, is it's from a conceptual standpoint, it's really important to think about cost per bushel and step away from cost per acre. Historically, we've focused a lot on cost per acre to accommodate what you were just talking about with respect to productivity. If you look at it on a cost per bushel basis, you've captured that change per acre cost as well as any potential change on productivity. So that's why we're focusing on cost per bushel and not thinking so much about cost per acre. So Jim, we want to focus on, you're going to talk a little bit about nitrogen and also on phosphorus and potash as well, and start off talking about some ways that we can really optimize our investment in those key nutrients.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. First talk about nitrogen. About half that fertilizer budget is the cost of nitrogen. Of course, it's very important for corn in increasing and maintaining yields. So it's something we want to use efficiently and make sure that we don't reduce it too much at any point in time. So first thing to do would be to maximize the efficiency of the nitrogen application so that more of it is used by the plant and less of it is lost to the environment. And in our environment, first and foremost is to apply as much of the total N demand of the crop in season, because that exposes it to less weather. You have less opportunity for it to be lost, yet it's there for the plant to use early in the growth period. And we'd suggest sometime between about V3 and V7, which is 3 visible collars to 7 visible collars, and probably about 6 inches tall to about knee high, or 12 to 18 inches tall. Anhydrous ammonia is a great fertilizer, but it's not the perfect fertilizer. So you also have to control when you apply that anhydrous. So fall is usually not a good idea because you can lose a considerable amount. And in the spring, the later it's applied, the better, with the reservation that if it's applied close to planting and not very deep, it can affect the germination and seedling establishment. So the most important aspect is to have it 7 to 8 inches deep, or use GPS and RTK to place it between the rows rather than near the rows. And a good time to apply it is somewhere about 10 to 14 days before planting.
So Jim, when I look at number one, I know a lot of growers worry about the risk of not getting nitrogen on the crop in a timely fashion. And you suggest V3 to V7. You've done some research here at Purdue, along with colleagues at, I think, the University of Missouri, that has looked at what happens when you put nitrogen on late. And when I say late, well, I'm going to let you explain that, but later than we typically would want to do that.
Yeah, so we've done a number of experiments with comparing at planting, traditional side dress around V7, and applications as late as V15. And we found...
And tell us what V15 is.
V15 would be 15 collars, and you're about a week or so from tasseling. So
Wow.
very late in the vegetative growth stage. And we've sometimes lost yield with those late applications, but usually it's a small amount of yield, and in some cases we made full yield potential, even though it's been applied very late in the season. We haven't looked at early spring or fall nitrogen, but in Missouri they have compared it to early spring nitrogen and found that the loss of nitrogen and the loss of yield due to the loss of nitrogen was no different with the very late applications at tasseling to the very early applications in the spring. So the penalty on average was about the same, putting it out in early March and waiting till the corn was shoulder high or taller. So,
and I think for a lot of farmers, and certainly from my background, that's a surprising result.
yeah, it was surprising to us too.
Okay.
Some people may have heard me talking about sending Bob into the field to grab ears for a field day, and him coming out with these full-size ears from corn we didn't fertilize until V15. And at the end of the year, those plots made 230 bushels. And they were only about 11 bushels off of the traditionally timed fertilizer. And about 110 bushels was made from that late application. So the potential with good weather post-application from late applications is very high. However, I wouldn't plan to do that.
Right.
But if you get stuck in a place where that's necessary, there's a lot of potential for the plant to respond.
And I guess it occurs to me that if you've held back from these in-season applications because you were concerned about the risk of not getting it on, for example, by V7, you should maybe rethink that a little bit and maybe be more favorably inclined to use an in-season application program as a part of your nitrogen application program.
Yes, and I think it's clearly beneficial to move from fall nitrogen, which we still have 10 or 15% of the acreage fertilized in the fall, move from that to side dress with the idea that you can rescue a crop if you can't get in, and then similarly with the early spring. If you're putting on anhydrous just before planting, that's a more difficult decision because the anhydrous is a pretty stable fertilizer when it's banded late in the spring, and there's probably not a benefit to that. But certainly the early spring and fall applications have more potential for yield loss than a V10 or 12 application in season.
Yeah, and so to clarify, and you've got it up on that slide, so when you say about just before planting, you're really talking about within 2 weeks prior to when the corn goes in the ground,
yes,
right?
Yes, and if you can precision place it, it could be the same day. It's just not everybody uses RTK, and if you plant on the same day and your depth is not 7 to 8 inches deep, then you can have some damage.
Okay.
That'll reduce yield.
You've got some more suggestions about maximizing efficiency. Let's see those.
Yeah, sure. So at least about half the farmers, at least in Indiana and Ohio, use urea ammonium nitrate or liquid nitrogen for fertilization. And just like anhydrous, when you ban UAN, it's slower to convert to the forms that are lost to the environment. And so anytime you can inject a ban versus a broadcast application, you'll lose less nitrogen. You get more yield out of a given pound of nitrogen that's applied. And part of that is because of the urea, which is half of the liquid nitrogen, can be lost to the atmosphere as ammonia when it's left on the soil surface. So that's important for liquid nitrogen. It's really important for granular urea, and about 10% of the acres are fertilized with granular urea, and you have the opportunity to lose in no-till up to 30% of the nitrogen that's applied to the atmosphere within a few days of application. So that makes that nitrogen a little bit more expensive. Even as a non-economist, I can figure that one out.
So Jim, on that number 3, you say injected bands of UAN are less prone to N loss than broadcast. Is that even if you're incorporating with a disc or a field cultivator?
No, if you incorporate an inch or two of soil, it'll pretty much prevent that ammonia loss.
So that's a surface application, like for example, after planting would be a fairly common.
Yeah, after planting or with herbicide. Mm-hmm. The Bill Johnson, the weed scientist, tells me there's no reason to have liquid nitrogen from a herbicide efficacy in the pre-plant herbicide. Mm-hmm. Yet a lot of growers put 20 or 30 gallons out. Sometimes that's a substitute for starter fertilizer, but it's a fairly inefficient method for providing nitrogen and a fairly inefficient way to apply starter fertilizer. So if you can move some of that nitrogen to either starter or side dress, that would be beneficial as well.
So the term in the industry that gets used a lot for that's the weed and feed programs,
right.
And you're suggesting that's not an efficient way to put on nitrogen.
Yeah, from a nitrogen standpoint, if it's left on the soil surface and not incorporated, then you have the volatile losses. Even if it's incorporated, it converts quickly to nitrate. A quarter of it's nitrate when you apply, and that form is easily lost from the soil with excess moisture. So it's just not the best way to apply nitrogen.
Okay.
And then we're going to talk a little bit more about point number 5, which is to adjust the rate of application based on the cost of nitrogen and the value of the grain. And that's something Bob Nielsen and I have been working on for the last 10 years or so, is building a database to make good N-rate recommendations. Key to this is knowing what the yield response curve looks like. And I say curve because it's not a straight line. And that's why we don't fertilize for maximum yield. So at low levels of nitrogen, a pound of nitrogen returns a lot of grain. This curve is pretty steep, and it's economical to apply more nitrogen. But eventually you get to a point where the returns begin to diminish, and you get less grain for every pound of fertilizer nitrogen applied. And this is where we're going to try to shoot for, somewhere in this area of the curve where it begins to provide diminishing returns. And then most years in most soils, eventually the yield response plateaus, and you can add more nitrogen, but you don't increase yield. And generally you don't decrease yield either. It just plateaus and remains constant no matter how much more nitrogen is applied.
So Jim, to clarify, what you and your colleague in Purdue Agronomy, Bob Nielsen, have been doing for over 10 years now is doing research at the Purdue farms and cooperatively with farmers here in Indiana, field level, field scale research to estimate that yield response curve that you were showing a minute ago, right?
Right.
That's really been the goal, to estimate that curve so that you could identify what the optimum N rate was given different corn prices and different nitrogen prices, right?
Yeah, correct. And for our recommendations, I think we have about 150 or 60 experiments incorporated into or as the basis of those recommendations. And a number of the Corn Belt states you'll see later have taken a similar approach and also built a pretty robust database to estimate that yield response.
It's also important to point out that you've got these yield curves by region in Indiana, because these optimums obviously vary as you move across Indiana.
Correct.
Yes.
And we'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to illustrate here the point that the profit, we're going to shoot for profit. We're not in a yield contest. We're not winning a prize. We're not showing off for the neighbors. We're trying to make the most money. And the optimum rate of fertilization to make the most money is somewhere below the optimum rate for making the most yield. And if you look at this graph, the blue line is the yield response, and this is actual data from an experiment we conducted here in Indiana. And then the gray line is the loss to the maximum profit. So you see it peaks somewhere around a couple hundred pounds of nitrogen per acre, and then if you add more nitrogen, you increase your cost, but you don't produce any more yield, and the profits begin to decrease. And for this example,
and for a little ways on that curve, you might actually get some additional corn, but the cost of getting that additional corn is more than the value of the corn coming back, right? So.
Right. And you have a lot of leeway, easily plus or minus 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen, and you don't alter the profit very much because of the nature of that response curve. There's a plateau in the profit as well, and it just doesn't change very much as long as you're in the ballpark of what's optimum.
And that's the term you and Bob like to use, ballpark optimum N rates,
because
right?
it does vary by field and by year. And a lot of our experiments conducted in the same field every other year in a corn-soybean rotation. And in general, you see the optimum varying 30 to 40, plus or minus 30 to 40 pounds of N per acre from season to season.
And that's in hindsight,
right?
Right.
Yes.
So in other words, after those fields are harvested, obviously you can go back and determine, using the experiment that you're conducting, what the optimum was for that year in that particular field, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it's important. Our recommendation over the long term is going to result in the highest profit, but in any one year, it's unlikely to be perfect. It's unlikely to be a
Because you don't know
Correct.
what the conditions are going to be
Right.
that particular year, right?
And that's where the nitrogen models that are coming on the market, show promise in being able to adjust the recommendation based on weather, soil, etc. But I think they still have a little work to go, and the ones that we've tested haven't been as good as the standard recommendation. So,
Okay.
It seems to me, Jim, that's why the in-season might be increasingly important, because if you can gather more information in season, you might be able to change how much nitrogen you
yes,
put on.
it's a model's not too helpful if you're putting out nitrogen in October
Yeah.
for corn planted in May, and unless you come back in the spring and rerun it, and it tells you need more because you lost it. So to me, that's a bad approach, right? Doing something you shouldn't be doing because now you have a tool that can tell you you were wrong, and you can spend more money and add more nitrogen. But eventually, perhaps those models will get good enough that they'll be able to adjust if you're in season for whatever weather has occurred. And then if the climatologist could actually tell us what the weather is tomorrow, we'd be able to do real well at making predictions. So I just want to illustrate, the economics can change the optimum nitrogen rate quite a bit. In this particular example, the economic optimum was 25 pounds or so less than the agronomic optimum.
The key, though, I think, Jim, is to think about, when you think about the agronomic optimum rate, that's a rate that would be optimal if nitrogen was free, right? And of course, that never happens. It's never free. And we're going to talk about the nitrogen rate calculator here in a minute. But as you think about changing nitrogen prices a little bit, as long as you've got a nitrogen price in there that's pretty close to market rates, the recommendations aren't super sensitive to that. But the failure to incorporate the cost of nitrogen in at all can lead to a big error, right?
Yeah, and we'll see coming up here, the next slide after this, that how different it is, maybe at current prices, between the making maximum yield and making maximum profit. In Indiana, we've got some pretty variable soils, and so we've tailored our recommendations to different regions based on the experiments conducted in those regions, and those recommendations can vary substantially.
And this is an improvement, right? Because a few years ago, you didn't have enough research observations to make these regional recommendations, but as you've gathered more and more data, now you're able to fine-tune those and literally ask that question, what part of the state are you in, what kind of soils are you on? So that's really a nice improvement.
Yeah, and initially all the states, as they rebuilt their end recommendations, had a single value for the entire state, but Wisconsin now has at least 2 regions, maybe 3. Illinois has had 3, northern, central, and southern. And then Iowa, I think last year, went to a 2 recommendation system. So the southeast soils that are more poorly drained and heavy have a different recommendation than the rest of the state. So as the states have built these databases, they've been able to separate out the different soil types and regions and make better recommendations for those areas. And we won't dwell on Indiana here, but you can see that on our sandy, non-irrigated soils with $3.50 corn and about 50 cents a pound nitrogen, the recommendations 188 pounds of nitrogen per acre for maximum profit. And we have some soils in northeast Indiana that are more poorly drained, where losses of nitrogen are greater, where we get less nitrogen from the soil, and the recommendations all the way up to 214 pounds of N per acre with these economic conditions. So we have some as low as 170, so that's a swing of about 45 pounds per acre.
Yeah, that's a lot. And the other thing you and I were talking about earlier before the program started, Jim, was the fact that as you look, for example, at northeast Indiana, where the soils are more poorly drained, the risk a lot of people think about is if they're thinking about an in-season application of nitrogen, they're concerned because those poorly drained soils might make it difficult to get into the field during the growing season. Your research would suggest, though, that perhaps they should be looking even harder at an in-season application rate because they might avoid some of those early season losses. Is that right?
Correct, yeah. The more poorly drained soils, the opportunity for nitrogen loss is greater than the better drained, say, silt loam soils. Now, sandy soils, of course, would have the same early season risk, a greater early season risk because they're more porous. But among the majority of soils in most of the Corn Belt, the more poorly drained, the greater the losses and the more benefit to a later application.
And combine that with the research that you've been doing and Missouri's been doing on these late season, in-season applications, and the fact that those are still extremely beneficial suggests that maybe there's more opportunity to do even more of the in-season applications than what people have been doing.
Yeah, and you know, it's hard to change practices, and if a lot of growers maybe had all pre-plant nitrogen are now considering putting some of the nitrogen pre-plant and then the remainder side dress, so they feel some comfort in having some out there early and some benefit to the plant getting it off to a good start. But then they also can come back later when the risk of loss is lessened and then put the remainder of the nitrogen. So.
Okay, great.
Another thing that's really interesting here, Jim, is, and I just caught this now, I didn't see this before, when we were talking earlier about this before this program, is there seems to be a lot of difference between the agronomic and the economic rate in Northeast. That suggests to me that in that area it's very sensitive to nitrogen price in corn. And I think that's important to point out to people. You know, it's 214 here with 350 corn and 50-cent nitrogen. If that changes, that recommendation needs to be changed. And so I just wanted to note that.
Yeah, and
there is a difference in sensitivity of this economic rate of return across regions. It does differ.
Yeah.
And one of the benefits of actually the publication that you've got listed on the screen, that we've got the website here at Purdue Agronomy for the nitrogen rate publication that you and Bob Nielsen have developed, that you update every spring, and you'll be having a new one of those come out here in a couple of months probably. That gives you that opportunity to fine-tune that because
ranges.
you've got some great tables in there that allows you to look at changing corn price, changing nitrogen price, and the region of the state that you're in, and so you can fine-tune using the pub, or and if I think we've got maybe a screenshot of that pub.
Yeah, and we'll go to that publication. All of the concepts about nitrogen loss and timing and the benefits of that are also in this publication, as well as the tables that allow you to adjust that recommendation based on price of nitrogen and value of the grain.
So that's a great summary of the information for Indiana. If you're outside Indiana or inside Indiana, you can also use what's known as the Corn Nitrogen Rate Calculator.
Correct.
And we've got that website address up on the screen, and that's a screenshot of the opening site of that. You might walk us through how that works a little bit,
Yeah,
Jim.
so you can choose the state and then the rotation, and that's one thing I wanted to mention. Our recommendations are based on corn grown after soybean, and we did some research in the first few years to determine what the corn penalty is. And we found, as they did in some other states, that for corn after corn, you need about 40 to 50 pounds more nitrogen than for corn after soybeans to maximize profit. So the other states would have that incorporated into their recommendation. You would choose the rotation, put in the prices of fertilizer that you anticipated and prices of grain, and push a button and it would give you the optimal recommendation. There's also some graphs in there that illustrate the potential for yield loss and the attainment of the level of yield that would be attained as a percentage of the max. And some of the sites, and the Indiana one doesn't because of some vagaries in how we handle data, would show you the range and optimum N rates across all their experiments. So there's a lot of information in there. Our publication has a lot of explanation and verbiage and important information that's not included in the calculator. So I'd suggest people look at the publication, and if they want to play with numbers and they like pushing the button rather than following a column in a row, to use the calculator to get the optimum rate, and then use the publication for the details.
Yeah, and then obviously for our viewers that are not in Indiana, the nitrogen rate calculator website is clearly the way to go, right?
Yeah,
okay.
And if you're, so there's a number of states that don't use a nitrogen calculator type approach to making nitrogen recommendations, and they use a yield goal based approach, which was typical in Indiana and most of these Corn Belt states before we adopted this corn nitrogen rate calculator or MRTN approach. But the research that we've done and why we've changed has shown that there's no relationship between yield attained and the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that needs to be applied. So there's not a good basis for using that to determine the optimum rate.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, going back to the slides you had where you showed the curve, what you've done over the course of more than a decade now is take that data and use it to estimate that curve, and then once you know the curve, the shape of that curve, you can simply use the math to look at what the optimum rate is given a given corn price and given a particular nitrogen price.
Right, and the yield attained. Mm-hmm. And what it turns out in our case, and I think this is going to be true for other areas, is the poorer soils, the ones that have less optimum drainage, they're not as productive. Typically, they actually require more nitrogen fertilizer be added to attain those lower yields. And so that's kind of the opposite of what most people think. The really great soils, we have a few in western Indiana, make tremendous yields at lower amounts of nitrogen than on our poorer soils. So,
yeah, so it's really interesting to think about the old yield goal-based recommendations versus the recommendations coming out of this. You wind up with a much different picture, don't you?
Yeah, so you're actually, we're over-fertilizing the productive soils and under-fertilizing the less productive soils.
Yeah. So a pretty big change there.
Yeah.
All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about potash and phosphate.
Yeah, so I think this is an opportunity. You know, in nitrogen, we're fine-tuning the application. We're changing the N rate a little, maybe 10 pounds, 20 pounds per acre. But here with phosphorus and potassium, we can make some pretty big changes in a year like this where money is tight. And so the recommendations that we've typically made are called the build up, maintain, drawdown philosophy. They're very conservative. They were developed when people owned a lot of the land they farmed, or they had some long-term commitments to farmland. They maintain soil fertility status. They minimize the risk of yield loss. And in times like this, we can take advantage of that approach by not fertilizing certain fields and with certain soil tests. So I want to illustrate how we'd modify the recommendation based on not having a lot of money available for fertilizer. So just to illustrate this philosophy, on the bottom of this figure we have soil test level from low to high, and then going vertically we have the fertilizer rate from a recommendation of 0 to a high rate. So it's just that part of it's generalized. And then we have a couple points that are marked. The first is called the critical level, and we have a 15 there, and that means 15 parts per million of phosphorus in the soil test. Some soil testing laboratories report soil test levels in pounds per acre. And if you use a soil test laboratory that does that, the equivalent pounds per acre would be 30. So 15 parts per million in the soil equals 30 pounds per acre in the soil.
Okay.
And below that level, we'd expect at some frequency and magnitude to get a response to fertilizer, phosphorus fertilizer that we added in that season. Okay. Above the critical level, there's a low probability of getting a response to fertilizer in that season, and the higher you go, that probability goes to 0. And then we have a maintenance limit, and in this case it's 30 parts per million or 60 pounds per acre. And we're going to try to maintain with this approach a soil test level somewhere in that maintenance range where we have near 0 to 0 chance of getting a response to fertilizer in this season. So in this season, there's no profit associated with a phosphorus application.
Yeah, with additional applications of phosphorus.
Right. The soil has enough to produce maximum yield or optimum yield, and we're really just fertilizing the soil to keep it in that maintenance range. And that gives you an opportunity when prices are high or conditions in the fall are wet and you can't apply fertilizer or something happens to not put any out and still maintain yields. And then above 30 parts per million, the recommendation is reduced to allow the soil to draw down into that maintenance range. And eventually at 40 parts per million or 80 pounds per acre, the recommendation will go to 0. We've been thinking about this for the last few years, and that drawdown soil test doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would you be interested in letting the soil test fall super gradually versus fall gradually by putting none out? And so I think in the future, as we revise these recommendations, we're probably going to go to a 0 at 30 parts per million. It just doesn't make sense to put a little out and have it draw down super gradually versus just gradually. And I'll show you what I mean by gradually later, because soil test levels of phosphorus in particular do not change very rapidly at all.
And that's the question I had, Jim. You know, if you're in that maintenance range, let's assume you're kind of in the middle there, and you don't put any soil, any phosphorus on the corn crop this year, for example, and you did a soil test a year from now, would you expect to see any change in that soil test?
If you could take a really good soil test and average over all the variability, technically it should be down about 3 parts per million.
Okay.
So if it's at 20, it might be at 17.
Okay.
So it would change, but
you'd see a modest change. Okay.
A minor change, and because soils are so variable, practically you wouldn't be able to detect it. So
that's a very important piece of information, for obviously, because that means even a year or two, if you're at fairly high levels, you could even go a year or two.
Yeah, some of the research done over in Illinois showed I don't know, they had pretty high levels, maybe in the 80 part per million range, that 12 years later they're still above the maintenance range. So it took a long time to build the soil up, and it takes a long time to draw it down.
Okay.
Yeah. So at these high levels, the recommendation has been less than crop removal to allow it fall. In the middle, it's been crop removal, and at the low levels, it's been crop removal plus a certain amount of phosphorus to build up the soil to the critical level. And the recommendation has been designed to put about a quarter of what's necessary every year. So you would follow the same recommendation, and at the end of 4 years, you would have added enough to build the soil up to the critical level. So I think we have 2 opportunities. Above the critical level, particularly in the upper range of the maintenance range, upper level of the maintenance range, and certainly during the drawdown, in the drawdown area, we don't need any phosphorus this year. We can get by without it. We also have an opportunity that's a little bit riskier at low soil test levels, because the amount that's being added there is really more than we need to maximize profit, because there's enough there to replace crop removal and to build the soil up. And so the standard recommendation would be about 75 pounds near the critical level, which is about crop removal, and as high as 125 pounds per acre at about 5 parts per million, which is hopefully the lowest level we would see in a row crop field. But to maximize, so that would be the standard recommendation. And here's what the theoretical likelihood and magnitude of profit would be. Mm-hmm. It goes down to zero, of course, at 15 parts per million. And to achieve that, we don't need to put on that full crop removal and build up amount to build up the soil, but we probably need around the critical level about 45 pounds per acre of P2O5, and at those low levels about 90 pounds of P2O5 per acre.
To maximize profitability.
Yeah. And it gets a little risky at those low levels, but if you've been at those low levels, I'm not quite sure what you've been doing, because it's hard to get to those low levels. We see them, and we see them a lot because we're troubleshooting problems, or we're analyzing samples that have been sent to the plant problem clinic. So I think in times like now, where there's no profit in average production, where people have built up their soil, they've stored some of that nutrient in the soil, that they can use that reserve to reduce their fertilizer purchases this year. And as Michael indicated, that this is not just a one-year thing and you got to replace it next year. You never have to replace it if you're at high levels. And if you're in the maintenance range, eventually you might have to replace it, depending on how fast the soil drops.
So an opportunity to fine-tune your phosphate applications.
Yeah, to eliminate some of them and delay others. Definitely if you have low soil test levels below the critical level, you want to think about partitioning fertilizer dollars to those fields and areas in fields. But if you're in the high part of the maintenance range or above, you should feel comfortable without putting.
Yeah, so to put that back in economic terms, if you're in that maintenance zone, you're cutting back on the input usage, having no impact on yield, no expected impact on yield, and that's a way of reducing your cost per bushel. Mm-hmm. On the left side of that chart, where you're at those low levels and you're actually getting enough increase in yield from those phosphate applications, you're also able to reduce your production cost per bushel because of the yield boost that you're getting out of that additional phosphorus.
Mm-hmm. Correct. And those rates that I illustrated that were different than the original recommendations should be sufficient to optimize the yield and profit.
Yeah, and so help bring down that cost per bushel.
Yeah, they're not greatly shorting the crop, but they're not fully replacing what was removed, nor increasing soil test.
Plus the buildup, yeah.
So that in that situation, you might anticipate down the road having to put out the fertilizer that you could have and should have put out this year.
Yeah, your long run goal is still to get up to that maintenance level at some point in the future.
At some point in the future, if you're going to continue to farm that land. And I think it's a much more complicated question if you're renting land and the tenure of the rent and how that affects that decision. That's pretty complex. And what your relationship is to the landlord and what kind of agreements you have in place and things like that.
Okay.
And as I said, soil test decreases pretty slowly. So 200 bushel corn removes about 75 pounds of P2O5 per acre. And given the general rule of thumb, that would be a 3 to 4 part per million decrease in soil test levels. So things do not change rapidly with phosphorus. the same approach is used for potassium. It's a lot more complicated because our recommendations are based on the cation exchange capacity, but you can use the same approach, and I've just illustrated here. Potassium does change a little more rapidly, and well, before we get to that, the change in the recommendation, 50 pounds of K2O per acre would be sufficient around the critical level, and at low K2O levels, maybe around 100 pounds per acre. So again, you can modify the application rate because you don't need to build up the soil, and you don't even need to fully replace crop removal. Soil test potassium will change faster than phosphorus, and it'll decrease about 1 part per million for every 6 pounds of K2O removed in excess of application. So 200 bushel corn might reduce soil test K about 10 parts per million. So it will move down faster, and you won't be able to go as many years without making applications.
Okay. So I guess to sum up, I think, when on the nitrogen side, first of all, take a look at the nitrogen rate publication that you and your colleague Bob Nielsen have put together. Gives a nice review of some of the things we've talked about here this afternoon. Also provides the tables that you can use to fine-tune your application rates here in Indiana, depending on where you're at in the state and corn prices and nitrogen prices. Whether you're in Indiana or another location in the Corn Belt, you can use that corn nitrogen rate calculator. And the website address was up on the screen earlier, and I'll post these slides on our website so you'll have access to that a little bit later. On the P&K side, you've really got some opportunities there. The one challenge, and you kind of alluded to this, is you need to talk to if it's on a rented land situation, you need to have a conversation with your landlord. Michael, I think on some of the cash rental arrangements that you and I have been asked some questions about, some of those have some specifications in there with respect to how much P&K you have to put on. Some of them might be tied to soil tests, some of them might be tied to maintenance levels. A conversation needs to take place there because we're in a challenging economic environment, right?
And even if there wasn't specific language, you'd probably like to rent that ground for quite a bit longer than just 1 year, and so that conversation needs to take place even in that situation.
Yeah, so transparency is the recommendation there, but there's an opportunity, and it does require having, first of all, a good set of soil tests, right?
Right.
That's the baseline.
Yep.
And once you've got that, then you've got some opportunities to back up a little bit and have that conversation and make some management choices based on the information.
And if you're a landowner, there's nothing wrong with asking for those soil tests if you haven't been doing that already, just to see what's going on.
Yeah, good point.
On the ground that you're leasing.
Yeah, and I think all three of us have been involved in situations where we got called in later where there was a problem because there was a lack of communication with respect to what was taking place. So, good points.
Yeah, and one of the things mentioned in most of these good Midwest soils, they change pretty slowly in pH, phosphorus, and potassium. So if you have a good every 4-year, every 2-year soil sampling and analysis program, you won't get caught off guard by having unusually low soil test levels or building the soils up beyond where they need to be to maximize your profit. So I think it is key to do a good job soil sampling, actually look at the results, modify the applications based on them, and continue to do that over time on a periodic basis.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that with us, Jim, today. For our viewers, I wanted to make you aware that we do have another webinar coming up fairly soon. On the 31st of January, our colleague in Ag Economics, Maria Marshall, will be joining us and talking about the family business as a competitive advantage. And of course, that applies not only to family farming operations, but a wide variety of family businesses. And she'll be talking about some ways to leverage the characteristics of that family business and make that a competitive advantage. So join us for that webinar on January 31. We'll have more information on our website. And of course, you can always register on the website. And we've got a wealth of other information on the website that you can also tap into. So we'd encourage you to visit our website, which is just purdue.edu/commercialag. And we'll have the webinar up. We'll have the slides up from this, and you'll be able to tap into those as well. Thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of the Center for Commercial Agriculture and Purdue Extension, we wish you a good day.